Hey, hello, leavers and believers. Welcome to Leaving Hillsong. My name's Tanya, and you have arrived right at the right moment. If you have an interest in true crime, if you have any kind of interest in celebrities, and if you like that as a sport, you've come to the right place. Today we're going to discuss the closing arguments in the trial of Brian Charles Houston. Now, I will explain this in the pod in more detail. Jake from the Framework is joining me on this. We both attended both days of the end of this trial. They had run out of time when the trial concluded in December at Christmas. So they had to put aside 2 days for closing arguments, and yeah, we were there. Now, it is a bit of a complex case. We're trying to explain it as best as we understand it, as best as possible. Please, though, if you have any questions, jot them down and send them in. It's a fascinating case. It just takes a little bit to explain it, and it's worth knowing. While I was editing, though, I did notice there's a few extra names there that, people might not be familiar with. In particular, please pay attention to this most fascinating character of Pastor Barbara Taylor, who I think she must be about 90 years old now. And the story goes that Barbara Taylor was the first person to find out about Brett Sengstock's sexual abuse at the hands of former pastor Frank Houston, the father of Brian Houston. Barbara Taylor wrote letters, she kept notes, and she was the one who persistently tried to get an outcome for Brett Sengstock. It had been her church that an evangelist called Kevin Mad Dog Mumford, he had spoken at that, and for some reason, Brett's mother decided this was the moment she was going to reveal her son's story, and she did so to Barbara Taylor, who then went to incredible lengths to try and get a meeting with a Houston, any Houston, and yeah, you'll hear more about that in the pod. If you don't know Jake Elliot from the Framework, please check that out. He's a diligent, devoted type, and he's the one with all the details. I'm the one looking around the courtroom going like, am I really here with these people? I mean, Brian's sister Beverly was there, right? And she was in the Luna Park train fire, like on the ghost train, like the OG one. And I was like, oh, I can't believe I didn't say that to Beverly. And so Jake took notes. We are going to do a back to basics as soon as possible with our American consultant. So don't worry if all of this doesn't make sense, but we did just want to give you a bit of an update before the verdict is delivered on August 17th. So get your snacks, kick back, and settle into the closing arguments.
Hey, Jake.
Hi, Tanya. How you going?
I'm good. How are you?
Very well. I think I've recovered from the trial now. Yourself?
Oh, it's like a psychological beating or something, being in that courtroom. Yeah, it took a while to, process, sort of recover is the right word, you're right. thank you very much for agreeing to join me once again. We both attended both days of closing arguments, and that took place on the 15th and 16th of June of this year, 2023. So the trial for Brian Houston had taken place in December of 22. Brian has been charged with one count of concealing a serious offence, that being the child sexual abuse. I believe it's just the one incident. Yeah, it's just the one incident against one victim that was perpetrated by his father, Frank Houston. And the case went for nearly 3 weeks through December till just before Christmas. And they ran out of time and they needed closing arguments. So they allocated 2 more days, and there seemed to be no room on the calendar for another 6 months. So that's been the time lag. There's been a huge backlog from COVID in the courts, as well as finding a time for everybody to schedule in. So that's how that cookie crumbles. And just trying to think if we left anything out of that actual charge. It's difficult to sum it up, which I guess is what the closing arguments are for. Hey, so do you want to pick off with what you got, Jake? I mean, there's basically 2 days we want to cover. Whatever you got, whatever you want to start with, I don't know. It was the prosecution was up first. His name is... Here's another Gareth. There's 2 Gareths in the courtroom. The judge is called Gareth, and the prosecution is called Gareth Harrison. And
Yes.
He speaks with quite a strong Scottish accent. It's adds to the kind of, oh yeah, you're a little bit young, but there was a show called Cracker, and it was Cracker, and he was a forensic psychologist, and it was fantastic. It's terrifying. Anyway, this guy's not quite Cracker, but I reckon it adds to the...
And we had the defense, Mr. Philip Bolton.
We did.
The best friend.
Yeah. So again, to run over for people outside of the Westminster system that we have here, I mean, it's a local court matter, so it's, people don't usually necessarily have such high levels of representation, but it's a serious crime in a local court. So both of those men is a barrister. Nobody was wearing wigs. They don't have to in the local court, so there was none of that. But yeah, I mean, Bolton's he used to be president of New South Wales Bar Association or something like that. Like, he's just got all these senior kind of places in the history of the law. He's an old man. He's been around a long time. He, charges a lot of money. And then there are his instructing solicitors. So there's 3 of them. The prosecution has help as well, other solicitors. He's got a team there, and very old school. What do you reckon? Yeah.
Yep. Nothing to say at the moment. Yeah.
All right. I mean, the prosecution kind of summed their case up. We were talking before, and I said to you, you know what I mean? There was such a different method applied by each side. The prosecutor's very organized and kind of this and this,
Cohesive.
therefore this, and the defense is much more emotive, I felt, and tried to pull on that kind of common man's common sense with, moderated emotions, people don't think this, they don't do that sort of thing, rather than producing this sort of evidence and
it was much more
work.
I found Bolton in his argument, it was quite existential and philosophical in his quantification and how you should be understanding the law and understanding the circumstance that Brian was facing.
Okay.
You would agree with that, or was that
Oh,
too
yeah.
early?
Yeah. Trying to paint sympathetic pictures or trying to paint their sort of character portrayals of different people in those closing arguments. You know, be it John McMartin, who, you know, at one point he's bringing up his falsehoods and the next minute he's kind of defending him and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was
What
interesting
got-
with Bolton, he relied heavily on what I would almost call tainting the witnesses or people around Brian, just by calling people like Barbara Taylor auntie or Brett Senstock's mother Rose. He was
Okay.
clearly trying to almost he was putting a spin on each character involved because each one had the motive for Brett to not report it to police in some way. It was quite bizarre how he was trying to frame the narrative in favor of Brian. Like Brian was an honest man, but everyone kind of had their reasons not to be reporting it to police because one of the claims made is that anyone could have reported to police. So he was putting the onus that Barbara Taylor could have reported it to police, not just Brian. So there's that element. But the biggest thing that he was really hitting hard was like, it doesn't matter if my client was handled this situation right or wrong after the victim disclosed that he didn't want to go to police. Brian honored the victim's wishes by not going to the police.
Okay, so I'll stop you there, and we're so wound up in this thing. Let's take a couple steps backwards.
Sure.
Just to refresh everyone. So Brian has been charged with one count of concealing a serious offence. Now, there are excuses under the legislation for not reporting a serious offence to the police. And there's all kinds of details around whose responsibility it was and, you know, why other people didn't. But we'll, you know, setting that aside for now, there are what's known as reasonable excuses. So one of them is if you are in fear of your life. Another one is if the victim of that offence does not want you to report that to police. And a lot of this case hinges on that, whether or not Brian believed that the victim did not want this report, this crime, this disclosure, because after all, it came from his mother to a pastor, Barbara Taylor, that you've mentioned. It didn't come from the victim himself. Brett Senstock is his name. It didn't come from him initially. It was his mother who told a pastor, and then it has gone through this strange web of command and back and forth, and it, you know, over this long period of time before it reached Brian. And there's all kinds of debate about that, and, you know, how upset he was when he eventually was told, and, you know, why he was upset. And anyway, so that's what the case is hinging on, this reasonable excuse. Now, from everything that had been tendered so far, both in the Royal Commission that took place in 2014 and the evidence there and the evidence in this trial, there still does not seem to be any actual tangible evidence, be that, you know, a note in a diary or minutes in a meeting or a phone call. It is something that can really establish that, you know, that Brett Senstock was offered the opportunity to go to the police according to the policies and procedures. Tell me if I'm getting this anywhere right or wrong. According to their policies, which, you know, included when a complainant comes forward, reach out and offer them counselling, offer them the opportunity to go to police, all that kind of stuff, which was just
Messy.
overridden, basically. Well, it wasn't done systematically as it would appear in the policy. Yes, no, I mean,
Yes, close. Yes.
I mean, until this kind of phone call between Brett and Brian, where Brian goes, "Do you want counselling?" kind of thing. Like that's no.
Yeah, he did talk
Yeah,
about counselling in
tell
that
me.
session, and Brett and Stock pretty much told him to
Said
stick it.
no, and there's Brett repeatedly requests privacy. He doesn't want his identity out there. Yeah, so there's a lot of that. There's also, what did Brian believe? And I mean, what Brian believes is something that every second journalist asks me. Who knows what Brian actually, who knows what goes on in there? I don't know how you can deal with that. But if Brian believes that the victim did not want to go to the police, so I think there's almost two parts to it, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
How do you prove what the victim wanted, and how do you know what Brian believes? I don't know.
So that's the conundrum, I think, in a nutshell.
Can you? I mean, tell me.
And that's the hard thing to unpack, really, if you think about it.
Is that am I accurate there? I mean, tell me if it's.
I would say that was pretty accurate. I think you can get away with that.
It is newer legislation in that the part about it being child abuse offence. So under Section 316 of the Crimes Act, it's an offence to conceal a serious offence, but then the section about the child abuse became more serious when the gravity of that was changed to a more serious offence to conceal child abuse. The police got more powers. The offence, the potential sentencing, well, it's complicated because the offence is concealing a serious offence. So if you know about a murder next door and you help the guy next door cover it up or whatever, I don't know. It's concealing a serious offence. You didn't report it to the police. All right. So if you know the guy next door committed a murder and he killed his wife, whatever, and you don't report that to police, you're concealing a serious offence. If you're concealing child sexual abuse, they changed the laws at the end of 2018 to make that much more serious and to have jail time of up to 5 years.
5 years.
And 7 years if there was a benefit. So if you got a job or a promotion or a trip to Cancun or something like that, maybe cash payments or donations. Or so funny because I was talking to an American consultant yesterday and she was reminding me that in California, this is just jumping over to the whistleblower documents just for a little bit of a light interjection before we move back. In California, flowers, do you remember that huge gift register for flowers?
Yes.
Well, marijuana is legal in California and it's referred to as flowers. Find out what else they're concealing. All right. So that's why this is why it's somewhat new testing of legislation. It's the first time that this offence, concealing child sexual abuse offence, has been tried in this way. Before the laws were increased around the child sexual abuse concealment, it was just a misdemeanor. It was like bad language or jaywalking or those kinds of things. So it's a first for the detectives. It's a first for the VP. So it was a big deal from a bunch of angles. Yeah.
So you pretty much got a prosecution and defense arguing with what's in front of them from different perspectives. So I would say both have, we'll say yes, Frank Houston had committed sexual assaults, but then what did Brian do with the knowledge available at that time regarding Brett approaching him at some point, or him hearing about Brett not wanting to go to police? What did he do with that information? So the prosecution said the Crown would make the case that Brian Houston did not report it for other reasons apart from the complainant not wanting it reported. So
Mm.
the primary reason he did not report it was to protect his father and the church. So I think that's really important. That's why he's presenting in his closing argument a cohesive argument with all these pieces of evidence, audio bites, and actually laying some accusations against the accused himself, saying you were dishonest in the stand with other pieces of evidence, and you were dishonest to the AOG executive board, and you were dishonest to your church, and some of the audio sound bites. And so the defense, it was their job to show beyond reasonable doubt that Sandstock was adamant that he did not want to go to police and could have reported it to police himself. So same events, but just a different narrative. What evidence is available to really bolster that? The defense was also meaning to show without reasonable doubt that many thousands knew, including members of the police, none of whom reported to police. Now, he opened up with that at the beginning of the trial, but he was also making that very clear in his closing argument as well. And what was interesting with the closing argument is that he was, at the end of the day, trying to make Brian Houston look as though he was credible and that he was honest, and that everyone had their own motive why they didn't go to the police, like Barbara Taylor, because she wanted to actually manage this in-house before going to the police.
Raised a lot of interesting things there. So there was discussion around different motivations, different reasons why somebody would do something. So Brian might want to protect his church at the same time as wanting to protect Brett Sangstock's best wishes. And, you know, two motivations can exist at the same time. Which one's the one that you made the decision on? That, you know, that's quite a reasonable point. People obviously do things for more than one reason.
Yep.
Is it the reason? Is it an excuse? You know, Tiffany says reasons are just excuses in drag.
Nice.
So, and then they argued about that for a while. You can see how law gets complicated and messy real quick, and different interpretations.
Yep. So both sides were compelling. I would say the prosecution was compelling in a few areas. He made references to a sermon and also audio at Hillsong Conference in 2002. These two audios were in 2002, where he was pointing out the motivation for Brian Houston was he was there to protect the church because he was actually using that language in some of those audios. Another compelling argument as well was that he was actually accused of being dishonest, because here he was saying as well that with the meeting between Brett Sandstock and my father was just, you know, their thing. I don't want to be involved in it. It wasn't the church. But the prosecution was making the point that he lied to Barbara Taylor because that same meeting that he was trying to distance himself from was him telling Taylor, well, actually, the victim and Frank Houston and an elder all met to make sure that this was not being covered up and there was a process being involved that everyone was following. But like I said, that meeting was the meeting where the $10,000 was being given to the victim, which he was going, I've got nothing to do with that. So that's why he was accusing Brian Houston of being dishonest.
And just quickly on that famous meeting, you know, Brett Sangstock was hassled by Frank because Frank was getting old and he knew he wasn't, you know, going to have too much longer in him. So the story goes, he wanted forgiveness. A lot of it makes sense, I reckon, in Assemblies of God madness thinking anyway. So, you know, they're back at McDonald's and Brett is made to sign this napkin as a receipt of this $10,000 that Frank is proffering as this, you know, forgiveness offering thing. Why? The question came up, if that were just a gift, if that were a love offering, why the signature? Why did he need to sign? I wonder where that napkin got the napkin.
He's got the napkin. He's got the Mallison's document. Yeah, exactly.
Do we get to tell the Mallison story again?
Go for it.
All right. So what I want is for you to tell me if I get this wrong. Right? Because it's so unbelievably, if you wrote like a TV series and this, seriously? Okay.
I'm listening.
So when Brian originally went to the famous Qantas Club meeting, 1999, a couple of days before Christmas, and he called the executive together, just ad hoc, got Keith Ainge, who gave testimony at his trial, was the secretary, said just get the meetings, get the boys back together. He went through a series of, statements with that. It's in the minutes. He went through a series of statements. My father it's come to my attention that my father is this pedophile. He's done this thing, blah, blah, blah. Frank restoration. Look after Frank. Pray for Frank. How are we going to take care of Frank? We've gotten some legal advice. Don't worry, it's all taken care of. Step one.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can't help but see this now in retrospect. We jump to the Royal Commission. He would have never thought much. These are such rudimentary minutes typed up by, and obviously the minutes that they wanted to be seen. Who knows what else goes on in those
which I'm led to believe
meetings.
Brian who's met with Keith Ainge after to talk about the minutes and stuff like that. So I found that interesting. Yes.
Lots of books and minutes and duplications and things. Scene 2, 15 years later. Brian's on the stand at the Royal Commission, and the counsel for the Royal Commission, Semyon Beckett, says, tell us about this lawyer that you went to see to advise you, and how come they didn't advise you about reporting to the police?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And Brian's a bit, me and Nabi went to Mallison's. It's a really prestigious law firm here, and so we saw a lawyer, and I can't remember his name. I think it was Graham.
Yes.
That pretty much the Royal Commission. I'm not 100%. The Royal Commission's oath of honesty, or whatever you declare, which is where it's the truth and the whole truth, but it's also the truth according to what you know best on that day. So it's a different. You're not expecting a perjury charge after a Royal Commission.
Yeah.
So he knew he could just kind of, he's not the best on the stand, but yeah. But
he just threw it out there, and I've got a feling potentially he didn't think it was going to be challenged or investigated further.
Yeah. Any more than those
trial,
minutes were ever going to see the light of day, that they were going to be up on an internet for anyone to access from a government file. So then we cut to another 8 years later, and they go, okay, tell us about this guy called Graham, and what happened at, that during Brian's trial. Yeah. Tell us all about that meeting then.
And I just want to contrast what happened as well. Like, we had 2 detectives investigating this. They were able to come up with a check in May 1999 of $2,000. They're able to come up with a check of $6,000 in the year 2000, and they could not find any meeting or any document relating to Mallison's at all. That was like the needle in the haystack would be finding those checks. You'd think something like trying to find these Mallison documents or evidence of a Mallison meeting. Not there.
And Mallison's is not a firm to lose their files.
Exactly.
It's just not a possibility. I think they did find a Graham that worked for Mallison's once.
Yes. But they found a needle. They found the checks. You'd think the Mallison document would be so much more easier to find.
Well, this was a document, wasn't it, about how to manage a payment to Brett or something? What was that? Yeah. That legal meeting supposed to be about? That's what they went through the contract. Remember this contract?
It was almost a written up contract for someone like Brett to sign.
Because there was no record of that. No one had a copy of that either.
The nature of the document was in question as well. Like, what was it?
Nam didn't have one. Brian didn't have one.
And it conveniently went missing, leading up to having Frank Houston hand it over to Brett Senstock to sign.
Now, I wonder what relation, just by the way, I wonder what relation that lawyer is to. We'd had legal advice and we knew that my father would be incarcerated if he were charged.
So I would like to make that point number 3 from the prosecution. He was actually calling, like I said, Brian Houston dishonest. He actually quoted Brian Houston dishonest in relation to that Mallison's document. He actually said Brian Houston's made it up. That meeting never happened. So that was a big claim to make by the prosecution in his closing argument.
Obvious. I mean, hilariously obvious, but I mean, it does lead one to wonder what else he might make up.
Well, personally, from my personal experience, I've seen Hillsong puff and bluff in the past when it's come to its own members or other ministries as well, whether they be online or local.
Incredible, and they get away with it. They must be so used to getting away with, I've done it. Don't worry about it. Yep, we got legal advice. All good.
It could have potentially been something that's a huff and puff and bluff scenario, and this time they're going, well, we're trying to find evidence. Yeah, that's all I better say on that, because I don't want to talk about anything else on that. How Hillsong operate like that.
That's all right. You're right. What's next?
Okay, so what's next? So I just pointed out that the prosecution looked at the audio, looking at his motivation, how he was wanting to protect the church, and then having a go at his honesty, in question Brian Houston's honesty. That was to do with the Thorn and McDonald's meeting, as I just said. Now the Mallison's document. He also made the point as well, George Agajanian. They said that when he was asking George Agajanian on the stand, what was the motivation for not reporting it to police, George Agajanian repeatedly stated, because the man was of age. He was 37. He could have gone to the police himself. He was of age. He could have gone to the police himself. At no any point in George Agajanian's testimony did he say, we didn't go to the police because the victim didn't want us to go to police. And so I didn't understand the strategy of why the prosecution was really focusing on his testimony, because he was making the point that at any time, George Agajanian could have said, we didn't go to the police because the victim told us not to go to the police. It was never there in his testimony. And he was really contrasting George Agajanian's testimony to Brian Houston. Brian Houston going, we didn't go to police because the victim didn't want to go to police. George Agajanian was convinced that they didn't go to police because he was of age to go to the police. So that was, to me, a big piece in favor of his argument. And now I understood the strategy as to why he was doing what he was doing. That was a very compelling piece of evidence. And that was from George Agajanian, Brian Houston's right-hand man.
And
that was
business manager, and he's much more savvy and
as Brian Houston said,
would know the right words to choose.
And as Brian Houston actually said when he took the stand in December, George Agajanian was very big on legal this and legal that. He actually had to go at George Agajanian for being incredibly stressed about little legalities, and he was kind of belittling him on the stand. I'm thinking, for someone who has potentially more of a legal mind than Brian Houston, it would be weird that he wouldn't actually be adamant if he heard that the victim didn't want to go to police, or if he was privileged to that discussion.
That's interesting. Okay.
You know what I mean? I just found that the prosecution could have drawn that out of it, but I think, as we all know, the judge will be reading both sides. We weren't privileged to hear the entire arguments. They were just giving the key points. So that's possibly going to be emerging in what the judge will be reading, those little details. So yeah, the prosecution really did a fantastic job.
Oh, so confident in his clarity, I think.
And another very persuasive piece as well is that even if Brian didn't report it to police at the respect or to honor the victim's request, he made a comment when the second victim came forward in the year 2000, how in the minutes of that special elders meeting with the Hillsong elders, now that you know that there's other ones, like there was no incumbency, there was no feeling that maybe now we need to report not just these other victims from New Zealand, but also Brett, and actually name him and talk about the payments that happened between Frank and the victim. And he would point out that this was not recorded in the minutes of the Hillsong elders meeting, that special elders meeting. So I thought that was now that you know that there's other victims, why wasn't the discussion about Brett in that meeting going, well, now that there's other victims involved, we probably have to report it now. We might need to contact Brett. We might need to go what actually happened with that exchange of money. And he was talking around that specific thing as well. And I thought, valid again. So there are my 5 points that I took away from the prosecution's argument
Okay.
that I thought were very compelling.
We're up to 5 already. Okay.
One with the audio talking about him protecting his church, motivation. Thornley meeting, he was pointing out his character, being deceitful. George Agajanian, contrast and testimony to Brian of why they didn't go to police. Allison's document, dishonest character, accusing him of having that meeting, and the fact that why wasn't he talking about Brett Sandstock to victims? That's 5. But I thought that was pretty.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I just didn't realize they're up to 5 already. There's so many different ways of looking at this, and so many sort of things that come out to me that you say out of each kind of angle. There's more angles, and then there's more like kind of. But what about? It's, I guess that's what some of the concern is. Once you start talking about things like different motivations, which are reasons or are they excuses, and if they're reasonable reasons, are they reasonable excuses? About that, it makes it kind of, if it weakens the legislation or strengthens it, but it certainly made it more complex. Seems like there's a lot more ways of getting around it.
Now, do you want to talk about the defense, or you still want to talk about the prosecution?
No, sure, whatever.
There's a confusing timeline we need to address, I think, in the middle of this.
Please.
Okay, so
give us what you got.
The prosecution gave us a pretty solid timeline of events, but an area that was not really understood well in this argument was like, when did the victim not want to report this to police, and when did the victim want to report this to police? And I think the defense really capitalized on that, because his argument was the victim was adamant not to go to police, and that's Brian Houston's claim as well. The victim did not want to go to police. But when you look at the timeline in 1999 specifically, yes, Brett did not want to go to police because he didn't feel like he was going to be believed. Barbara Taylor didn't feel like she was going to be believed. But when
hang on, where does it say that Brett did not want to go to police in 1999?
That was in the writings of Barbara Taylor.
Did she say doesn't want to go to the police, secular court?
She was saying that I will not take this to the police with you, but then started speaking.
Secular courts.
Secular court. Sorry, secular court.
Secular court.
Dang, sorry. Thank you for catching
No, and I mean, again, for me, and this is just my interpretation. So court is a different thing to police as well. So, you might even consider going to police, but not wanting to then proceed to court. I don't know.
But the problem, the issue was, the motivation was for him not to be proactive in holding Frank Houston accountable at all. Because
yeah, but
he didn't feel like he would be believed. It was his word against
law and their policy. Was he not supposed to be offered, did you want to proceed to the police? I'm sure that was in their policy that they had ratified in the May. Remember the policy manual that wasn't at the meeting?
Yes, you're right. Yes, in 1999, December. Yeah. Oh, no, you're right. Sorry, yeah.
There was a policy manual that they had ratified in 1999 in May, had they not? And they're like 6 months before the meeting that dealt with this, that said if the complainant came forward, they were to be offered the opportunity to go to the police. Yes? Or we'll go over it at some point, because that's the whole thing. They didn't follow their own policy.
Yes, they did not follow their own policy. You're right about that. I'm just pointing this out, that Barbara Taylor didn't feel like she was getting anywhere with John McMartin back in the middle of 1999. The victim, Brett Sandstock, was feeling deflated. He didn't feel like he was going to be believed, because I think there was a discussion about going to courts or looking into it, but he just didn't feel like he was going to be believed. He just wanted it to be dropped completely, even though, Barbara Taylor was trying to push this entire thing uphill. So when Kevin Mudford contacted Bill Johnson, and Johnson contacted Agajanian, and Agajanian said to Brian, "It's about your father," that's when things started to change. When Brian got that confession and Barbara Taylor realized that Frank had confessed to Brian, she told Brett. And you can see in the correspondence in around about November, her documenting this and communicating to Brian Houston, "I've noticed a change in Brett Sandstock's behavior. He has softened. He now feels he's believed. And now he wants me to tell you that he's now thinking of going and seeking legal."
Just to clarify that very quickly, once again, because it's, this whole snakes and ladders of these snakes. John McMartin was the state president. I think he was the next in the chain of command for Barbara Taylor, who also was Brett's aunt. You know, so when she's applying pressure, it's family pressure as well. His mother had already warned him, offered in the strongest possible terms, you know, you don't want to send people to hell by making this public and turning people away from the faith. I don't think you can put any stronger pressure on somebody not to go to the police their whole life, to take it to the secular courts. Brian gave evidence that he thought secular courts were civil courts because it's always about the money. So that was another kind of defense he was using.
Another thing as well is that Brian knew that Barbara Taylor didn't want to go to police. He knew that she wanted to keep it in-house.
Yeah.
Brian Houston knew Brett Sandstock's mother, and that Brett
Suited him
Sandstock
well.
absolutely loved Frank and Brian. So all the chips were here in his favor. Just saying.
It's the entire culture, and that's something that you remember we were so frustrated with when the defense lawyer, Philip Bolton, was arguing that, you know, yes, Brian might have called it a serious moral failure, but so what? He hadn't named exactly what it was, but he did at a different time, and these people over here knew, and some people knew, and people talk. He said people talk over coffee afterwards. You know, that what did he say? They might do it in hushed tones, but you know, word gets around, which is, you know, culture of silence that even you and I have witnessed when you know big events happen. People are shut down immediately. It's none of your business. It's between them and God. The whole thing.
I think Jeff Bullock's a good example of that.
Yeah. But there's many examples, and people are just there's some kind of negative innuendo placed over their head, and then they're not to be talked about at all. So it's a bit frustrating when that culture isn't understood about whether somebody wants to go and involve courts when they're involved in such an extreme religious group, basically. Yeah, there's a case on I was reading this morning of some really small religious group, and they withheld diabetic medication from an 8-year-old girl. She died. They were praying instead and expecting healing. But it's a very small group. Now there's 14 people being held in custody over that. They've all refused legal representation, and none of them have even applied for bail, even though it's only 2 charged with manslaughter. So you can see the whole faith thing.
Yep.
And the connection with the reality of legal stuff. You know, it's a kind of, I know that's an extreme example, but it's the same sort of God will fix it.
There's a real primitive gullibility in it, which is really sad, which is not what the Christian faith is about at all. But they kind of just combine,
with their own kind of hope. And it's a very extreme kind of everything's going to be okay thing, or I'm the leader of the free world, nothing can go wrong.
So in November, from my understanding, this was the time that Brett and Brian somehow communicated. I'm having difficulty picking a date, but the Crown seems to be pretty sure what that date was, or in their arguments. But within that discourse, it seems that's where Brian got the idea that the victim didn't want to go to police. And to me, I'm pinning it around in late November, because this was a letter from Barbara Taylor. I just want to read it out so you can see exactly both what Bolton and also the prosecution were focusing on, because they were both coming into this letter exactly because it was such a powerful testament as to what Brett Sandstock was feeling at that time when Frank confessed. 29th of November 1999. Dear Brian, I was overwhelmed on Saturday as I realized the beginning of steps you have taken to not only do right, but to be seen to be doing right concerning the incident that occurred 30 years ago with AHA and your father. My prayers have been for you and your family as both a son, a father, and a leader of leaders. I spoke to Brett's mother on my return on Friday, and she also was feeling very much for you and your father as well as AHA. AHA is Brett Sandstock. I think for me it has been a time of mourning. When I rang AHA on Saturday morning and told him that your father had confessed and was being stood down, he was so very, very soft. He said he was in absolute shock that your dad had actually not denied the incident. I think the dodging of the issue was causing the anger to accentuate. There was a complete change in attitude. I advised him to see you for ministry. He wanted to know if I had told you, that's his Brian, he was thinking of legal proceedings. I said, of course, that you know everything there is to know to this point. Can you see why that's the important bit here?
Wow. Yep.
So the prosecution is
Is that
going,
the end of that
obviously,
letter?
you knew he wanted to go to the police
Is that the
and
end of that
there's some
letter?
legal proceedings, and you decided to go start seeking legal advice too. And at the same time, you got Bolton somewhere in this potentially talking about Brian Houston now engaging the victim, going, well, I knew that the victim didn't want to go to police and I honored that decision. It's this document that I think.
Is that the end of that letter?
No, they were reading at the scripts at the bottom. I'll keep going. I said, of course, that you know everything there is to know to this point. Should the Holy Spirit prompt you to contact him, Brett Senstock, his address and telephone number is ... At times like this, I remember that on Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand. I am reminding myself that God is the same today as last week and will be the same tomorrow. There is no panic in heaven, only glorious plans for the future. How he does his work with our clay feet, I will never understand until I see him face to face. Now, that's the end, but she has got in scripts key dates. This is the 31st of November. Before I sent this, I heard from Brett's mother that Brett was trying to contact Brian. And I highlighted this, and the prosecution pointed this out, saying it was around this time that the Thornley McDonald's meeting had already happened, because Brett was making the comment that he was trying to contact Brian Houston regarding the money because he didn't get it.
Right.
And so that's why the Crown was saying at this point, when you look at this letter, obviously the Thornley McDonald's meeting happened before in November, because he was trying to get the money because Frank didn't give it to him. So he was trying to contact Brian to get the money.
So by the time they have that Qantas meeting, Brian knows what to say because the money's been paid. Call the boys together, wind the year up and tell them, don't worry about it. We've had legal advice. We've spoken to the victim. Happy New Year.
Well, actually, it's worse than that, because it's like, now that the victim's been dealt with, the victim's going away.
Yeah.
He's now Frank's happy. So Frank is leaving the victim alone. He's potentially leaving his son alone. And Barbara Taylor, well, this needs to be done. Well, we're going to hold an AOG executive meeting to make sure that this is dealt with. And after that meeting, nothing happened. And Barbara Taylor felt like she was sidelined. And in that meeting, in that AOG executive meeting as well, the prosecution was very big and majoring on the fact that he failed to mention the payment of money. He failed to mention Barbara Taylor's presence at all.
And that's where I'm still going, wow, okay, yeah, because you've been a genius in putting this together all these years, Jake. You've been an absolute genius. So we've got the money's been paid, the napkin's been signed. There's
Barbara
been
Taylor's out of the picture. I'm not even going to mention her to the AOG executive.
And then focus the AOG executive meeting, which was appropriate because that's their function. Throw a meeting before Christmas because you can't stand it any longer, I guess, and get Frank's credentials removed, which really does deflect from a lot of things, which is demonstrated in the minutes that they were very Frank focused. So, yeah.
But what was interesting as well is that they concluded that Brian Houston was going to be alerting Frank to the outcome of this meeting, and he was going to be alerting the victim of the outcome of this meeting. And he didn't do any of those things. But what's interesting is that, they had no clue about Barbara Taylor, because she was trying to meet up with Frank. She was trying to get the victim solace, peace, justice, or comfort. So she would have been the perfect one for them to report to ensure that Brett Senstock got closure. But they didn't know.
Yeah, you can see in that correspondence, Barbara's a pretty strong lady, but she's also somewhat naive to all of this. And as we all...
She felt she was being cut off.
Yeah, but she's also talking to Brian as if he's, I guess, a lot more receptive. She had presumed he'd be a lot more receptive and responsive than he was.
She admits she was naive in hindsight. Yeah.
It is a fascinating case. It was a fascinating case to watch.
I want to talk about Bolton, because I think so. That's what I find interesting with Bolton. I had difficulty trying to pin down exactly where in his story or narrative or date this discussion Brian had with Brett Senstock to honor Brett Senstock's request to not go to the police. So to understand what Bolton was arguing. He was saying that he was doing his best to honor Brett's decision. So I'm personally having difficulty being thorough through the timeline and the calendar of events, how this entire narrative fits. But he did make the claim that in spite of if Brian handled this, anything outside of that decision, rightly or wrongly, did he honor Brett Stanstock's wishes, believing that if he did not want to go to police, he did not have to go to police. That's where I was a bit emotional towards the end of this argument, because I'm thinking this is now just a legal technicality or issue, and is that enough for Brian Houston to get off? So he was quite compelling in his in trying to capture the existential crisis of Brian Houston. And I think we both felt that a bit, going, oh.
Yeah, I mean, if you can kind of pick apart the things that make up the other person's argument, which is what he was doing, sort of find their loose threads, as it were, unravel. Yeah.
I can imagine Bolton going, there's so much evidence that's come out of this Royal Commission, we're going to have to argue this on a technicality. That's how it came across to me personally.
Well, again, maybe it's, looking at the legislation, and if a reasonable excuse is that you believe the person doesn't want to, then they're going to have to look at every word in that statement.
Yeah.
Potentially. Who knew?
Who
knew?
So, yeah.
Yeah, lots of lessons to be learned for other people as well and other organisations. I think this is, it might be taking place in a local court, and, there may, but yeah, I think it's going to have some big ramifications for how this is dealt with. Look at you, smiley face.
I know. I think we did an all right job, and I think we can wind up. You can end it.
See you on the 17th of August.
See you on the 17th of August, Tanya. It's lovely working with you.
Bye.
Well, that should have made things clear as mud. Is everybody up to speed now on how the Australian system works? Or yeah, have had a couple of people outside of our fair land ask, why the delays? And look, it's a question. It's one of the questions we ask every day in this country. Why do we have to wait? Essentially, there was, COVID backlog. I understand that, Americans move things really quickly, and, you would have had a verdict the next day. But, we've just got to wait for everybody to find a convenient time. Thank you so much for sticking around and, making the best out of the bad lot, I guess. We had some news this week. So first of all, last pod I talked about somewhere, my cynical self, about how often we seem to see convictions in Australia overturned, especially for high-profile people, most notably George Pell, who was the third highest Catholic in the world. He was convicted of an actual sex offence, but it was overturned in a higher court, and it can really put a lot of us off and make us a bit, disappointed. So I had mentioned that, and our Leaving Hillsong legal consultant Nick got in contact with me and said, I'm listening to the latest pod and I have some thoughts about the discussion of appeals and juries. From a legal perspective, it is incredibly difficult to overturn a conviction. You need to find a legal error that is so serious that it's enough to cause doubt about the conviction. Appeals are never based on judges deciding that the jury made the wrong decision. There is a huge deference given to the judge and jury who sat through the trial and heard all the evidence. One of the fundamental legal principles of appeals is that they won't hear arguments about the facts of the case. You can only make arguments about legal errors. But there are cases when legal errors were made, but the appeal court said it wasn't enough to overturn the conviction. The difficulties of undoing a conviction are apparent in miscarriage of justice cases, like the recent pardon of Kathleen Folbigg. And if you don't know about Kathleen Folbigg, go look that one up. Folbigg. Kathleen with a K. There was never any evidence that showed that she killed her children. A lot of good lawyers that our Nick knows have always had concerns that she wasn't guilty based on the case against her. It took multiple appeals and 2 inquiries over 20 years to finally get to the place where it is accepted that she didn't kill her children. Lindy Chamberlain was on her 3rd appeal to the High Court when the case against her fell apart and her conviction was quashed. A big part of the problem is that appeals are always made on technical legal grounds. So non-lawyers don't understand the full reasons why. And then right after that, John McMartin, who has been a pastor in the Australian Christian churches this whole circus for 40 years, who had been convicted of indecent assault, had that conviction overturned and quashed. So, and that was based on a range of reasons from what we read. The appeals judge didn't like the credibility of the witness. I mean, there were a number of things, and it's just hard. And you kind of think of all the people that put the work in, and say, like with Brian's case, there was 7-8 years worth of detective work and just incredible stuff. And then what? So I guess we'll see. It's maybe a coincidence that John McMartin was actually the person that Barbara Taylor contacted next. Dunno. Thank you so much for spending time talking with us today. Been great to have your company. Please keep the support up. Send me those messages, stories, jokes. I'm here for the memes. You are fantastic. Please be kind to yourself this week. Be extra nice to yourself. Why not? Be kind to the people around you. And we'll talk really soon. Bye.